Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be starting our Alteryx Predictive Palette Custom R webinar right now. So as a form of introduction, there is myself, Sophie Harrison, and I'm a Senior Account Manager at Newcomp Analytics. Then I have my colleague, Kathleen, who is our Data Analytics Lead here at Newcomp. So I'm going to be kicking things off, and then I'm going to be passing it over to Kathleen, who is going to be doing today's demo of the Alteryx Predictive Palette with the focus on custom R models. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. With everything going on, we're obviously not able to run live events and interact with our clients and prospects in person like we normally do. So we're trying to run as many virtual events as we can so we can keep everybody engaged with what's new in the analytics market, and in particular with Alteryx. So we're trying to provide as much complimentary enablement as we can through this time. At the end of this webinar, we'll highlight some of our other upcoming Alteryx events that we're super excited about. So our objective today is to showcase Alteryx's robust capabilities within predictive analytics. We're going to be focusing specifically on the custom R model. And as I mentioned, we are hosting future events related to Alteryx. So one of them will be focusing on the Python models. And another one will be focusing on the Intelligence Suite add-on, which will include things like text mining and automated machine learning. So keep an eye out for those at the end of our webinar. I'll be mentioning the dates, and then we'll be sending links to sign up for those if you're interested with our follow-up email. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Newcomp Analytics, we are an end-to-end analytics provider. We do solution software licensing, implementation services, strategic consulting, mentoring, managed services, as well as training for all aspects of analytics. So that's everything from analytics strategy to data warehouse development to cloud architecture, data engineering, business intelligence development, data science, and other advanced analytics applications. As an Alteryx partner, we're here to support both people who are considering Alteryx as well as existing clients. So if you're using Alteryx on a trial basis, our job is to make sure that you have the support that you need to prove out your use cases through a guided trial. So that means that we're here to answer questions, we're here to do workshops with you, get hands-on with you, make sure that you're able to get the best out of your 14 or 30-day trial of Alteryx. So after this webinar, if you're currently on an Alteryx trial, which is usually 14 days, we can extend it to 30 days, and we'll be able to set up some of those help sessions as well. If you'd like to get a trial, we can arrange that as well, and we'll be here to support you through that trial period. If you're a current client, we can provide you with best practice advice, implementation services, staff augmentation, training, and mentoring. And if you are interested in looking at that Intelligence Suite add-on before the webinar we'll be hosting at the end of the month, we can actually set you up with a trial of that as well. So through our follow-ups, don't hesitate to reach out and ask for those as well. So at this time, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Kathleen, and we'll dive right in.
Thanks, Sophie. Hi, everybody. This is Kathleen speaking. Thanks for joining us today for part of the Alteryx Predictive webinar little series we have going on. Like Sophie mentioned, today I'm going to be focusing on R models, but in addition, I'm going to talk about how that relates to the predictive palette, since that's pretty much the hot topic that's going around these days. So if you've been to one of my webinars before, you'll know I try to keep it pretty casual. If you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat or the questions panel. It's just me monitoring it today, so if there's any kind of big overall questions, I will just leave them to the end. I believe this session is being recorded, so if you want to go back and look at anything you missed, you will be able to. And as always, feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions, something wasn't completely clear, or you just want to go back and see a bit of it again. So what I wanted to talk about today, and like I mentioned, if you were in one of the previous webinars that we had, I did talk a little bit about what is predictive analytics and the predictive palette. So the goal of most data mining projects center around predicting the behavior of future data. And this can be time-oriented or not, meaning that we can look at time in order to see the future of our data. But most importantly, we just want to have historical data, and historical doesn't always mean per time. In addition, it doesn't always need to predict some future value, but it can instill and model what we're currently working with. In order to make predictions on future data, there has to be a model that is built on some type of historical data that can capture patterns or trends of that current data. After creating the model on historical data, the goal is then to apply this model to future data or data where the predicted variable is unknown. In order to follow this, we like to follow what's called the CRISP-DM model. So this is the cross-industry standard process for data mining, also known as CRISP-DM. This is an open standard process, and the term machine learning, AI, data mining, analytics is thrown around so much these days. There are so many different interpretations to what it could actually mean. So I find it good in order to go through the general process. When most people think of the word data mining, they automatically think of running some type of advanced statistical algorithms on huge amounts of data. But in actuality, data mining is a process that requires methodology. So those who are beginning on their data mining journey will realize that it takes more than just advanced algorithms to make a project successful. That's why I always like to talk about the beginning of the webinar by following the 6 main stages of the CRISP-DM process. And again, if I've been over this before, then it is a really good refresher because I see it forgotten time and time again in tried and true businesses. The first stage we have is the business understanding phase. This is the most important phase in CRISP-DM. This is the stage where the business and data scientists come to a mutual understanding of the business objectives of a project. So many times I see somebody asking a question to be answered and a misinterpretation on the data scientist side as to what the question actually is. Making sure everyone's on the same page and has the same definition is going to save you a lot of headache in the future. Of course, any model that doesn't target the desired business objective has a low value to the company compared to the model that correctly addresses the business objective, which is going to have a higher priority, which is why this stage is so critical. This is also where we determine the business success criteria. So asking the business what would make this project successful and then agreeing on a reasonable target. There's a keyword there. The second stage is data understanding. So where the initial data is collected and explored. Each field is explained of what it represents, any non-obvious hierarchy mapping, for example, and what's unique about this project. The data quality is also examined here to see if there's any errors, missing data, or inconsistencies, and the decision is made on how to deal with these problems. The other reason that these steps are very important, because you'll see how Alteryx's new machine learning tools take this model into account as well. The third step is data preparation. And with data preparation, if the data is not in the correct format, it can take a long time for data scientists to clean it. Depending on how messy the data is, this stage could account for 80% of a data scientist's time during project. It's always super appreciated when companies have clean, usable data, but we know that's not always the case. Again, this is what really the backbone of Alteryx is to clean that data to put it in a usable format for your predictive modeling. The fact that we're looking at the predictive palette now is just a bonus. Next, we have the modeling stage where we actually perform our modeling based on business objectives. Then we evaluate the model in terms of accuracy. Companies can do this in several different ways. But one way that data scientists and new comp evaluator models is by building the model on a subset of data, then verifying the model on the unseen subset of data. For example, randomly splitting the data set into partitions of 70 and 30%, so we could build our model on the larger portion of the 30%, and then, or on the 70%, and then verify using the 30%. In this case, if it's not accurate enough or if it doesn't answer the business objectives in question, we go right back to the first stage and go back to the business understanding that we've created thus far. And you'll find in your journey that you'll take these steps multiple times in order to get to that last stage of CRISP-DM, which is deployment. So decide how to integrate the model into the business systems and reuse it over and over again. Again, just because you have a successful model doesn't mean it's always going to be a success. Companies change, adapt, and grow, as we've seen over the past couple months. So always very good to revisit this and make sure that we have the same business and data understanding. Now, on to the actual Alteryx Predictive palette. So in order to look at the predictive tools, we want to make sure that we understand what they are and what they're made of, which leads us to today's webinar. The predictive tools use the R programming language, and in order to download it, you can go to Options, Download Predictive Tools to install R and the packages used by the R tool. What we're going to do today is we're actually going to understand and explore that underlying R tool and what it does within the predictive palette. Sometimes the out-of-the-box tools for Alteryx don't exactly meet your needs in your organization, and you want to use your own R model in order to interpret your data. Some of the palettes that depend on this R code includes the suite of predictive tools that uses R, again, an open source code base used for statistical and predictive analysis. The tools cover data exploration, specialized elements of data preparation for predictive analytics, predictive modeling, tools to compare and assess the efficiency of different models, tools to group records in fields in systematic ways, and tools to help in deploying predictive analytics solutions. With the predictive model, for example, this category includes tools for general predictive modeling, both classification, so categorical target fields, and regression, numerical target fields, as well as tools for model comparison and for hypothesis testing, which is relevant to predictive modeling. The set of tools for this general setup, it's for your statistical models, and this is from the last webinar I did, and we're going to kind of dive deep into one of these predictive tools, see where the R code is, and then build one ourselves. We also have things like the A/B testing tool. This assists the user in carrying out A/B testing, also known as test and learn experiments, such as examining the effect of a new marketing communications campaign on sales, or the effect of changing store staffing levels. The tools can help in determining market areas for test, so usually for one that involves mass media advertising, where everybody residing in that area can be potentially exposed to advertising, and also matching one or more control units to each treatment unit that we have, developing trends, seasonality, control groups, etc. We also have time series. This category contains a number of regular univariate time series plotting and forecasting tools. Among the tools, we have ARIMA, an extended exponential smoothing forecast models, which can be used to create items like weekly sales forecast models. These methods are used in order to look at time-related elements, so trends, seasonalities, cyclical patterns that repeat over and over again. Something important to think about now, how our cyclical structures in our organizations have changed. In addition, we have predictive grouping. So this category contains tools to group either records or fields into smaller number of groups. Think of k-means, clustering analysis. And common applications for grouping records together is to create a customer segment based on purchasing patterns or creating a set of store groups. The ultimate objective of grouping in these two areas is create a smaller number of groups that allows for customization of programs and activities in a way that's feasible from a business perspective. Finally, we also have prescriptive. So this category includes tools that can assist with determining the best course of action or outcome for a particular situation or set of scenarios. It can help augment the output of predictive models by prescribing an optimal action plan. So what do these all have in common? Essentially, they use what is behind the development curtain, which is another palette that's used in Alteryx. When I talk about development or the developer palette, What I'm talking about is a category of tools that are used in order to create macros or analytics apps creation. You can even go so far as to run external programs for it. And the key takeaway is that all of these predictive tools that I just talked about are using these tools in their underlying code. So we have tools to input, export data, code with R or Python development, and troubleshoot any errors that we have using detours. For our particular use case, we are going to be looking at the R palette, and in a given organization, we're looking at a statistical procedure that does not exist in Alteryx natively. We're going to develop a code because, again, I don't have an out-of-the-box tool in order to create this. And I'm going to put it in a macro so even the newer, more basic users are able to use this without having to worry about code. These are no-code tools. However, we're going to put some code in them in order to create the no-code tools from them. Our goal is to learn to create that macro that uses the R code and also use it in a way to perform polynomial curve fitting. Now, if I scared some of you and you don't know what polynomial curve fitting is, that's fine. Luckily for me, I already have the code written up. So we're not going to go through how to write R, or intro to R or anything like that. We are going to take our code and leverage it within the tool. So we're going to be taking a look at this code and importing it. Now, I'm not going to go over too many of the basics of the tool because this is a predictive webinar. So if you want to learn more about intro to Alteryx, then please feel free to contact us and look at one of the older webinars into intro to the tool. We're going to start off with a little bit more of an advanced concept. And this is looking at macros, what they are, applications, and how to use them. Some of the tools that we're going to cover today is the macro input, output, drop-down, action, numerical up and down, and our tool. And if you've never used any of these tools, that's great. You're going to learn about them today. And if you have used these tools, hopefully you're learning a different way in order to put them all together. In terms of what a macro is, I'm sure many of you have seen a macro in Alteryx, but it's basically a workflow that's compressed down into a tool. You can take a section of the workflow, which functionality you want to frequently repeat, and convert it into a macro. This way you can easily access the function while not needing to set up the multitude of tools in the platform each and every time. For example, we'll see how to break down one of the predictive tools and how it looks like. In general, macros are used to solve a task or problem in a workflow that you need to repeat. And you might be repeating this process with the same workflow, or you could even save this with your group or organization. We are definitely going to look at some of the input tools, action tools, and ways in order to get this working all together. But the most important takeaway is we're also going to be looking at the R tool. It allows our code to be passed into it, which reaches the data Alteryx inputs and runs the code through the output nodes back into Alteryx. Now, let's jump in and see how this is going to work. So open on my screen, I just have a new workflow of Alteryx. And again, if you haven't seen the tool before, just a brief overview. Alteryx is split up into a variety of different tabs at the top called palettes. Each one of these palettes contain a variety of tools that can be used to import and transform your data. For example, the in and out palette has an input and output tool in order to input data from multiple data sources. We also have ways to prepare our data, like filtering out fields we don't need, selecting, deselecting tools. We've also joined disparate data sets together. So if you're combining a spatial file with something in your SQL database, this is a great way to do it. Parse information, summarize. You even have so far as to creating a spatial analysis. So seeing how far items are from each other. And then all the tools we need in order to build our macro. Then what I have is the predictive suite. Now, the predictive suite all has this little R icon beside them. And this means that all these tools are built on our code, like we're talking about today. So last time we did this webinar, I did a deep dive into linear regression. So let's go ahead and bring our linear regression tool onto my canvas. Now, if you have Alteryx yourself and you've opened it and you're thinking, Kathleen, I do not have these tools up here, I only have 2 or 3, that's because you haven't downloaded the R add-on. You can download it for free. All you have to do is go to Help, Alteryx Downloads, and download the Predictive Suite. This is going to download all the R-based tools. And I could see that they have a little R beside them. Now, like I said, I've dragged in the linear regression tool, and it's just kind of floating in my view. I don't have any data connecting to it. I don't have any outputs. On the left-hand side is how I would configure this tool in order to use it. And at the bottom is a preview of my output. A really cool thing is if I right-click this linear regression tool, near the bottom, I have an option that says Open Macro, Linear Regression. So this linear regression tool is actually a macro itself. And this is how it looks like. Now, it's a little daunting, so don't be scared. We're not going to build quite this today. But if I see a variety of the gray tools within this workflow, this is what the linear regression tool is made of. A variety of inputs, user, and development tools which are found in the developer palette. I can do things like import R code in order to change how the variables are read within the tool. I can filter out or create formulas for events that I want to keep. I can also create detours. So for example, if you want to bypass a particular output based on some type of configuration or going from one section to the other. Now, like I said, there's some good documentation in here. It may look a little bit overwhelming if you haven't seen it at first, but the main takeaway is that every single one of these tools and also these predictive tools are essentially these macros. They have some type of input, they have some type of custom checkmark boxes, drop downs that you can choose from, and that all gets packaged up and put into a tool that looks like this. I have a section to put my model name, select the target, and a drop down list as well. So pretty cool, and it's not only the R tools that have this, it's a variety of the R tools. A variety of the tools rather, but I did want to show you how this works. Just briefly, we have things like dynamic inputs, renames, errors, downloads if you want to download from a website or an API, dynamic selecting, and then Python and R. In the future, we will be having a Python version of this as well. But what I want to build today is I want to take my R code from my polynomial curve fitting, and I'm going to create a macro out of it. So let's get started. I am initially going to head to my interface tool, and the first thing that I want to do is bring in my macro input. Now this macro input is going to automatically convert my workflow into a macro, and I know that to be true because if I click on some of the blank spaces and go to workflow, in my configuration window, it says that instead of a standard workflow or analytics app, I'm looking at a macro here. I'm going to click on the tool again because what I want to do is I want to put in my own custom text input. And the reason that I want to do this is because based on the incoming fields I'm going to have on my data, I need to have some placeholders here. I want something to be my independent variable. So I'm going to have a column for y, x1, and x2. Next, I'm just going to put some arbitrary numbers in here. Now, the reason that it doesn't matter what numbers I'm actually putting in here is because they're going to be replaced with the actual data that I import later when I'm using this macro. The reason I'm just going ahead and putting so many decimal places at the end is if you use Alteryx's text input tool, it's actually going to take the number of decimal places and it's going to provide you with the smallest data type possible. But I know that I want these numbers to be quite detailed, so I'm actually going to make them a little bit longer after the decimal place And again, you could just put in whatever numbers you want here. After I input that data, what I want to do is I only want to keep Y and X1. So I'm going to use one of my favorite tools, the select tool, which is multifaceted. I'm going to bring select in, and I'm going to see that I have, 3-4 fields, Y, X1, and X2. I can bring in a second variable if I want to for an advanced version of this R code, but I'm going to leave it unchecked for now, just in case I want to bring it back in later. I can see that I have 2 fields, not that exciting, Y and X1. Now what I want to do is bring in my R tool. In order to bring in the R tool, I can head to the developer palette at the top of the screen and drag in my R tool, or I could use the search bar at the top of my screen in order to find it and bring it in. The R tool is a little bit interesting, mainly because I have an optional input and I can have multi-input as well. So this gray input with the 2 arrows means that I can connect multiple things to it, and also that it's optional. Let's say I already used my R code to input data. I don't technically need an input, but in this case, I do want to have one. I want to input that independent and dependent variable, my Y and my X1. Now, in the configuration window of the R tool, on the left-hand side, I have the option to insert code. I can look at progress, write output, creating graphs, update metadata info, which are some of the code that is just automatically included with Alteryx itself. In addition, I could also run the script to refresh. And if I want to know more about R, I have a little hyperlink that is also available to me that's going to open up some information about R in general. Now, this isn't going to link you to Alteryx. This is going to link you to the actual R project tool itself. So if you're interested in learning R just as a statistical tool in general, you can feel free to explore it as well. In my case, I already have an R code that I want to import here. And before I import it, I just want to show everybody how it looks like. So the R code that I'm particularly looking at is a polynomial curve fitting. And with that polynomial curve fitting, what I want to do is I want to apply certain variables to it. So under my R script, here, I have this R code. If you have a Notepad++, for example, or anything like that, you can go ahead and open it in there. In my case, I'm just going to open it in Notepad because this is all I have here. But I want to show you how the code looks like. So again, if you're not familiar with the code, that's fine. And if you are, then you'll probably be able to read this and see that it's pretty simple. So first thing I want to do is check if a package exists. I want to download the package, cran here. I want to read the number of K values. So again, I'm doing a polynomial curve fitting. I want to have a certain number of K folds. And also I want the user to be able to select how many polynomial degrees they have to choose from. Next, I'm actually going to read the data stream into R. So the data is going to come from read Alteryx. So it's going to look at that X and Y variable. I can even see get the user inputs and make sure the names are acceptable. So I have Y and X here. And in addition, I'm going to make sure that I create a visualization, an Alteryx graph, a particular width, height, and resolution, label the columns, etc. So a lot of different things in here that I'm going to need to reference in my tool. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this whole entire script or the code. I'm going to head back to Alteryx and I'm going to paste it in. Now, this might be a little bit easier to read than Notepad because they have a little bit of the color coding on. But everything with that little pound symbol, hashtag, however you say it, that's the comment. And then any of the other fields are fields that I want to bring into the tool. So for example, I want to establish an X variable and a Y variable. And like I said, I want my user to be able to choose that. If I want my user to be able to choose that, this is where I'm going to go ahead and leverage the tools that I have in the interface palette. From a drop-down, I want the user, in order to choose a variable, that's going to populate the field for Y, and that's going to populate the field for X. In order to do that, I'm going to go ahead to my interface palette. I'm going to take my drop-down tool, and I'm going to bring my drop-down tool into the tool. Before I do that, after my R code has been run, then I want this macro output to output that graph. So in order for the output, in order to be put on the canvas, again, in my interface palette, I'm going to drag the macro output to the screen and output it against 1. Now you'll see that you have 5 different ways that you could output data, similar to when we're looking at our linear regression tools, for example, or many of our tools, for example. You definitely have a variety of outputs that you could set up if you want to custom code that. In my case, I just have the graph that I want to see, and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to name this cross-validation error. And you can even do some customization, like say what number or what letter is in the input or output. For example, on the R tool, I have numbers 1 to 5. Let's say I wanted my output to be an E. Similar to in this tool, I have an O, an R, and an I. And then you could create documentation for your organization to see which is appropriate. Now, back to the actual R code, I want something to be input to my X and Y fields. So in order to do that, I'm going to head to my interface palette, and I'm going to bring in my drop-down tool. The drop-down tool does what you think it does. It allows you to drop down from a particular list. First, it asks me to pose a question. So the question is going to be, select the target variable. Looks familiar from some of the other predictive tools you may have seen before. In order for me to select from the predicted variables, I want to make sure the data from my input is being fed into this dropdown. Now, this is specifically going to be either those X or those Y fields. I haven't chosen which one yet, but I know the data from my input, that is what's going to allow me to choose this particular field. I also know it's going to be a numerical value, and it's not going to be a string. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect all these other fields. Next, where I want the data to update is my select tool, meaning that I want to specifically choose or select where the data is, where the target is going to replace, the Y field or the X field. After I drop the bottom of the drop-down tool to the top of the select tool, I have this action button appear in between. This is what's going to configure what action is taken every time I click one of the buttons. For example, in this case, I want to update the value, and I'm going to select my selected fields in order to do so by clicking on the drop-down beside selected fields and saying that the field's value is equal to Y. I'm going to repeat those exact same steps again, this time for X. So I'm going to bring in another drop-down tool. I'm going to connect the bottom of my macro input to the top, and I'm going to connect the bottom of the queue to the top of the lightning bolt for the select tool. Again, I know that I have some numerical values coming in that have decimal places. So I'm going to get rid of all those small values, all those strings, no date, time, no spatial objects either. And this time the question I want to say is, what is that predictor variable? Again, I want to configure my action button. So this drop-down that's selected is going to replace that particular Y field. And when Y is replaced, that is the data that's going to come in. Now you can see how this gets a little bit messy. It is a little bit of an art, kind of just reorganizing your tools. I do recommend maybe putting them in boxes or annotating them with documentation in order to make it look a little bit more clear. Now, so I have my drop-down, I have my X field and my Y field that's going to satisfy my X and my Y components in my R code. I need something for the x variable, something for the y variable as well. Now, what I also want to do is see how this is going to look to my end user. In order to see how it's going to look to my end user, I want to check out my interface designer. Now, you can either hover over interface designer at the left-hand side if you already have it, or you can go ahead to view and select the interface designer underneath. What this is going to do is it's going to show the end user how the input is going to look like, meaning what they're going to be able to choose from. In my example, when I'm looking at the interface designer, I'm going to have that first question, so choose that field for Y, choose the field for X, but what it's really going to say is select the target variable and select the predictor variable. So this is how it's going to look like. Now what I want to do is I still need to set up those target variables for my k-folds and also the polynomial degree from the R code as well. But this isn't actually going to come in from my data. This is just going to be something that I'm able to choose and relay back to this R code. The nice thing about this is I can still use these interface tools, but I don't actually need to connect them to anything. For example, let's say I have a question that says select the number of k-folds for cross-validation. The options I have, for example, are to choose from field types or even manually select values based on a different line. In my case, I only want them to choose between 5 or 10 k-folds, so I'm going to go ahead and choose it there. In addition, I also want to name this in order for the name to appear the same as what's in the R code. What I mean by that is in the R code, this is called k-fold. So in order for this random field to be referenced back to my R code, I'm going to go to the third tab from the top, and I'm going to rename this k-fold. Now the interface designer always comes up. Just make sure your mouse is to the right. K-fold. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing, except this time let's use a different tool. I'll use a numeric up and down. And this is going to be used in order to determine the degree of polynomials. So I'm going to rename this question. Select the maximum degree of polynomials. I'm going to make my minimum 1, my maximum 5. It's only going to increment by 1. And let's have my default be 2 with 0. Again, I need to make sure this has the same name referencing the R code. So I'm going to go to the little annotations tab, which is the third one on the left-hand side, and I'm going to rename this Pol degree because that's how it's named in my R code. And now I have it there. Great. So I have the data coming in. I have the input. You can change the input name, the anchor abbreviation. I'm just going to deselect show field mapping there. And again, all my outputs. After that's done, it's not actually referencing any incoming data. So this is going to load for a little bit, but then it's going to get an error saying that there's not enough arguments, there's too many arguments, or there's no incoming data. That's okay. What I want is this actual macro, and I'm going to apply this to my incoming data now. I'm just going to do one last check in order to make sure, based on the interface designer, I have select the target variable, select the predictor variable, select the number of k-folds for cross-validation, and then select the maximum degree of polynomials. After that's all been set up, I'm actually going to save this. So I'm going to save this as my R macro. Our macro, and you can see how it automatically saves as a macro type a YXMC file. Now what I want to do is I actually want to use it. And in order to use it, I need to import some type of data. The data that I'm going to import is just going to be like me prepping a regular data source. I'm going to bring my input tool. I'm going to connect to some data set. In this case, if you haven't seen it before, Alteryx has the ability to look at recent data sets, any saved ones. And in addition to drag and dropping files right here on the screen, you can also import things, for example, like JSON files, zip files, Excel, CSV, text, shape. Also from data sources, you can connect to Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, set up your own custom ODBC connection, Amazon, Snowflake, you name it, a lot of different things to connect to. And you can also connect to data in your gallery if you're working with the Alteryx server. The data that I'm going to select is information about cars. So it's just an auto CSV file. I always put a browse tool on my data just to make sure that it's coming in the correct format. And I could go ahead and take a look at some of my fields. For example, I have field 1, which is an ID. Then I have things like miles per gallon, cylinders, displacement, horsepower, weight, acceleration, year, origin, and name. So this is what I want to do my prediction on. I want to take a look at the miles per gallon, and I want to compare it with the weight of the vehicle in order to see if there's any type of relationship. Now, let's say that there is no cross-validation error for this, and no polynomial curve fitting. I can definitely try to predict it, but I don't have that individual R code in there. Luckily for me, I already created a macro in order to take in this information. Before I do that, remember I mentioned in CrispDM how taking a look at your data preparation is 80% of the battle. If I take a look at the metadata, I see that because this is a CSV, all my fields are coming in as strings. And I specifically selected numerical values in order to come into my macro. So I'm just going to do some quick cleaning by looking at the autofill tool, and changing each of my fields to something that's a little bit more appropriate. So for example, instead of strings, I have MPG coming in as doubles, horsepower, acceleration, etc. Now it's time for me to bring in my macro. You can definitely save macros to your palette, use your own custom icons if it's something you're going to use over and over again. Or in addition, you could right-click the space on the canvas, and you could go to Insert. And along with all your favorite tools, at the bottom, you have the ability to insert a macro. Now, I recently used the linear regression one, so it's on there. I could also browse for one, or I could click on our macro as well. This is going to, by default, just give me this blue circle. You can see that I have an input for my input macro tool, and I have an E for my output as well. Now I could connect my data, so I could populate what you think my target variable is going to be, and also what my prediction is going to be. In this case, my target field is MPG, and I want to use weight in order to predict that. For my selection, so the number of folds for cross-validation, I'm just going to look at the 5. You can change it to 10. And you could play around with the polynomial degrees, but you could see that I can't go less than 1. And I can't go higher than 5 because that's what's been particularly set by my user. In addition, when it goes through and takes a look at the R code, it's also going to show me how the result looks like at the very end. And it tells me even that I need to view a browse tool in this report tab. This is because if I go back and take a look at my R macro and the R code, the output that was specifically set is the Alteryx graph. Now, again, if you take a look at any of the other R models, you can also output the data. You can output a report if you want to, like they have in a lot of the tools. So I recommend going back and deconstructing it. But in my case, I just wanted to show how it would look like as a graph. I'm going to put the browse tool on, click run again. And now I have a graph with my cross-validation error. Now it says the cross-validation error for the polynomial as it decreases as time or as we increase here. So that's using the R model, going through and creating an application out of it. Like I said, some key takeaways here are looking at what the input of the data is going to be and referencing it in your R code as well. Now, a lot of questions I get about here are also replacing it with Python code. Yes, you can definitely do this using Python as well. We are going to have a Python webinar for it as well. So, cool way in order to look at your data, what I do recommend that you do is go through each of those predictive tools. And as you're going through each of the predictive tools, go ahead and right-click them and see how they can be broken down. In addition, there's a lot of great content online. So if you want tips and tricks for the R tool and how to import it, or if you're just interested in looking at the script, then please let me know. The nice thing about this is I no longer have to go through and set up all those input tools, which may be confusing to an end user. Instead, I just have this little individual tool that I can work with. And when I'm taking a look at the actual macro itself or the workflow, the info, and trying to customize it, then I could definitely do that all in the canvas as well. Just open it on the other screen there. All right, so if there are any questions, please message in the questions or the chat about that R tool and some of the things that you can do with it. In addition, some of the new exciting things that I wanted to talk about are the Alteryx Intelligence Suite. So machine learning creates accurate predictions to inform the best strategies for success in every team. It interprets past data to identify future risks and opportunities. And also it does things like see what is going to happen in the future for a particular line of business without coding or or without any statistical information. So this is a little bit different than what we just talked about, as in we just talked about importing our own custom code, but with the assistant modeling option, this is going to do it for you. When we're talking about assistant modeling, we mean that you have a data set, you're not really sure what type of model should be run against it. The Intelligence Suite gives you the option in order to choose what it thinks the best data set is for it. And the nice thing is it already follows a lot of those things we talked about in the CRISP-DM model. For example, selecting a targeted method, selecting data types, cleaning missing values, selecting features, an algorithm, and the leaderboard as well. So I just want to give a quick demo of that. So here I have a data set. This is just some casino data that I have here. This is how the Intelligence Suite looks like. I'm going to go ahead and delete that so we can make it from scratch. So like I said, I like to add a browse tool so everybody kind of understands where the data is coming from. And in this particular data set, I have some information about gambling stats across a variety of different countries in Europe, demographic information like gender, age, how much stake they put, how much they won, and how much information is there. So what we can do with the slew of machine learning tools in the machine learning suite is we have the ability to use this assistant modeler. I'm going to split up my data into two different sections, an evaluation and validation sample, and I'm going to run my model in order to trigger the assistant modeling tool. Now, you could do one of two things. You can either build your own assistant model, or you can use the expert theory. So this is actually going to just take your data and spit out the result at the end. I still like to see how this data looks like. So I still like to go through all the steps. So I like to go through the assisted modeling tool in order to showcase it. If I go ahead and click Start Assisted Modeling, what this is going to do is it's going to open up a step-by-step guide to everything that you will need to do in order for your model to be run. Now again, I don't know what the best type of predictor is for this, so this is the tool that's going to help me explore it. Nobody came to me and said that I needed this type of model, but I had this data and I had something I needed to predict. The tool is going to walk you through selecting a target variable, selecting the appropriate data types, cleaning up missing values, and any kind of select features, deselecting features that you might not need, and then finally selecting the algorithm. If I go ahead and start building the model, what it first asks me to do is look at a target variable. In my case, I want to look at my overall win, and I want to be able to predict if I won or if I lost, and by how much, based on the demographic information I have presented. Now, it automatically already cuts down my options in half. It allows me to choose a regression model other than a classification model. This is because classification is more for categories, so if you won or lost, but not the actual amount. Regression is going to predict that numerical outcome. I'm going to click Next. It's going to ask me if I'm sure that's my target variable, and then it's going to go into cleaning up data types. For example, this user ID has been automatically assigned as a numeric value, but there's a little warning beside it asking me if I'm sure. So I'm going to change that to an ID, and after I change it to an ID, that feature is dropped because this isn't actually a predictor that is being used in my data set. I still have things like age, country, which is numeric and categorical, that I could use in my analysis, and I also have information about the fields at the side. It allows me to clean up missing any values, null values, blank spaces, and if I don't have any, then I can just skip that step, which is pretty nice. And then this is the coolest part. So this is what actually shows if my features are good predictors or not. And the great thing about this tool is if I try to predict something based maybe on a formula that's too related to the variable data source, it's going to tell you if the features are too highly associated or even if they're weak predictors. So even before kind of analyzing the data too much, we're able to see what's a good predictor, what's too highly correlated, and what's a poor predictor as well. Finally, what it's going to do, it's going to give you a couple of options. In this case, it gives me linear regression, decision tree, and random forest, and it allows me to run the selected algorithms. It's going to run each of the models, and then it's going to place them in order of which one is most accurate based on the data that was just tested. For example, here it tells me a random forest model is a good predictor, followed by linear regression, followed by decision tree. If you want to look at an overview of your data, you can see how closely the values match, or if they match at all. The cool thing about this example is based on a previous workshop that I do, where we see that taking a look at how often your data repeats will help you predict. For example, in this data set, I have a lot of demographic information from Germany for men, and also Turkey, for example, but I don't have a lot of information about women or even about, people from Luxembourg, for example. So those are all those outliers you see. So how we would interpret those outliers and the results. So then I will tell you which indicators are the most important. In this case, it says the stake, the winning is a good one, age, country, and you see how poor of an indicator gender and country are because I may not have enough information there. Then you select the model that you want to showcase, and you can add the models to continue your workflow. Now, the nice thing about Alteryx is that's going to automatically add all those tools for you, all that cleaning that was just done, all that selecting or deselecting, and it's automatically going to place it on your workflow. Then what it does is it leaves an open space for you to be able to put in the information you want to validate against. So your new information, let's say, and it's going to run that model in order to predict the outcome. You can just throw a browse tool at the end or an output tool, and it's going to run the model. In my case, for example, I know that there's not a lot of country information, so I just go ahead and just deselect that. And what it does is it runs through that model again, but you don't have to set up any of it. It just kind of guides you through it and allows you to see the predicted results at the end. In addition to the machine learning suite, so it does allow you to drag in these tools individually. For example, if you want to do classification, regression, any of these predictions. And the way that it organizes the data at the end, it's going to tell you your overall win, for example. That's the predictor variable, and then the predicted value right beside. So you could just kind of throw this into your reporting tool, output the data, and start to use it right away. It's really nice. It really guides you through the information. And also included in the intelligence suite is the sentiment analysis or text mining. So for example, let's say you have survey data from your organization, or in my case, this is a movie, this is Star Wars. And what this is doing is it's actually looking at each line of data in the movie, and it's going to give you a score to say if it's overall positive or negative. Just like if you're looking at survey data from customers, you want to organize by the most negative cases first so you can answer them first, and then kind of retweet all the positive ones. In addition, it tells you things like information based on word clouds, so how often words are being used, how often they're being distributed in text. Maybe you want to change the language of your organization or your branding. And it also does things like inputs images to text. It does a great PDF input if you're organizing data like that, and also sets up image templates for you as well. Like I said, it'll organize it into the different categories and put a score at the end. So these two are a little bit bonus. These are just kind of some of the extra features that are now included in Alteryx with the intelligence suite as well. But we also have our tried and true predictive tools, which you can definitely customize. The machine learning and text mining tools are built with a Python background. The previous predictive tools are built with an R background. So as we slowly kind of move between the two, or move between Python, Alteryx continues to support both of them very, very well. So that's all I have. So I'll see if there's any kind of questions in the chat.
Something, we do have one question in the chat.
Oh, okay, sorry. I guess I just don't see it.
Oh, it's how do you do how does the drop down tool 10 and numeric up down tool work in the macro? Just by name matching the names in our code, then the values in these tools will get picked up.
Yeah, so the really key in order for those to match together, which is a great question, is this little tab here. So when you click on the configuration of any of the floating tools, there's an annotation tab, and as long as that name matches the name in the R code, so kfold matches kfold in the actual R code, then that is what's going to allow it to work, and that's what's going to allow them to map to each other. So it's just the kfold here, up here. So that's going to be the key there.
Good, thanks. I haven't seen any other questions come in on the chat or the questions tab. So we'll wrap up with a few more slides. In the meantime, folks, if you do have any questions that you thought of, feel free to pop them in there and we'll address them before we wrap up. So as we mentioned at the beginning, with our follow-up, we'll be offering to set you up with a trial or extend your trial if you are not currently on one. And if you're a current client, we can help you get set up on the Intelligence Suite trial that Kathleen previewed a little bit at the end there. As well, we're here to help with any workflow building and any training requirements, so feel free to ask about those. These are some 3 really great events that we have coming up. The Machine Learning Bootcamp Blitz is going to be an overview of our Machine Learning Bootcamp, which focuses more on the Intelligence Suite add-on. So this is a great one to join in if you're curious about what our bootcamp entails. If you're looking at getting a little bit more into that, it shows you what we'll be showing in the formal bootcamp, but of course you'll also get some great information out of the webinar itself. And then on the August 24th, we have our Alteryx and Tableau Office of Finance webinar. This is really relevant, honestly, if you use Tableau or looking at Alteryx or vice versa, curious how they work together. It'll apply to everyone in that sense. It is a specific Office of Finance example, but you'll still get the benefits of learning how those tools work really well together. And then we have another webinar which we'll be doing in October, which will be very similar to today's, but with a focus on Python instead of R. So we'll be sending over the information on all these links with the follow-up that we'll be doing shortly. If you do have any outstanding questions after that follow-up, feel free to reach back out to us. We're here to help with any questions, and we can get Kathleen engaged with any of those as well. So we're right on 3 o'clock. Oh yeah, of course, sorry, I don't want to go too much over, but we do have a couple more training courses coming up at the end of August, so we'll be sending over information to this as well, including the deck. These are great opportunities if you want to do a full day instructor-led online course on Alteryx. We go from beginner to advanced, and there's also one specifically on predictive concepts, which of course would go deeper into what we showed today. Kathleen, I believe there's one more slide as well. Probably two more actually. This is the boot camp, which we'll be walking through during that webinar. Sorry, one more again, Kathleen, sorry. There we go. And then these are our other boot camps, which are a little bit broader outside the Alteryx world. But if you are interested in learning about any of these topics, they vary from a quarter day to a full day, and usually are based upon a group of users within your organization. So you'll be receiving all this information with our follow-up. We'll be sending you over the slides. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I hope that you found the information helpful. And thanks, Kathleen.